Hello, welcome to the first session of short form criticism workshop, Conditions for Judgment with Sean Tatol. This workshop engages participants in the discipline of criticism as a contemporary practice. The qualitative judgment of art has always been a fraught process. Following the decline of art historical canon, various critical and/or theoretical discourses, and the debilitating rise of social media, the prospect of criticism seems nearly impossible, but this sense of impossibility is a mere cultural norm, and the prevalence of ineffectual art writing that diverges from criticism only proves criticism's necessity. This workshop will examine the history of the field of criticism and its enduring usefulness while grappling with the act of writing criticism in the present. We will consider the qualities that characterize a new form of criticism that is informative, articulate, entertaining, and more importantly, brief yet powerful. The workshop will center on the importance of short form writing in a contemporary online context that has become the new locus of discourse, using the example of the instructor's own writing on the Manhattan Art Review. In this process, the act of judgment will emerge as an integral and communicable operation in the ontology of art, and participants will learn through practice the means by which authentic judgment occurs. Sean Tatol is an art critic based in New York City. He writes primarily on his website, The Manhattan Art Review. The Manhattan Art Review favors short-form reviews of art exhibitions with a 5-star rating system, prioritizing strong and potentially divisive opinions in contradiction to the polite conventions of mainstream art writing. By this approach, he aims to emphasize the importance of judgment in art criticism in the hopes of fostering a functional arts discourse that welcomes disagreement, debate, and renewed attempts to grapple with the complexities of art.
All right, I guess we start. So uh, I've never been an instructor of anything before, so bear with me, and I hope this is more of a dialogue type format than just straight lecturing, because I don't really know how to do that. But so the two texts for this week, the Oscar Wilde Critic as Artist, and then my own negative criticism piece. I kind of paired the two uh, as a not a joke, but kind of like it was tongue in cheek for myself, because basically I read this Wilde essay a couple months after my piece was published, and I felt that he said everything I was trying to say uh, so much more directly and thoroughly than what I was trying to say, that I was thankful that I didn't read it while I was trying to write the piece, because I would have just given up. Because um, I mean, I already felt the piece was, inadequate to my initial um, aspirations, but that would have just really like sunk me. But so I reread that yesterday. I didn't read my own piece, but hopefully I remember it well enough. But I mean, I really do think that sort of to a kind of astounding degree, almost everything I think is just already just in that piece itself. So I don't know, what did people think of it? Does anyone want to talk, or is it kind of, are people afraid? How does this work?
I feel really confused because I printed out all the things on the document sheets, but
Yeah.
I didn't know that we were supposed to read Oscar Wilde, so forgive me, I'm not gonna be able to
Okay.
participate. Maybe there was a email that I misread.
The lists on the syllabus lined up each week, but then there's some of them are PDFs or pictures of books that I sent But then there's also online links, and the wild piece was just a URL to a old website that just has
Okay.
the entire essay.
I apologize about that. I would have loved to read it.
I mean, clearly I highly recommend it.
Yeah, I will.
Yeah. Anyone else have any?
I'll talk.
Yeah.
I thought the wild piece was quite beautiful
Mhm.
and really expansive, well done. It had been a long time since I read anything by him, and I guess I had kind of forgotten that he's actually a good writer and just kind of, was like that dilettante or whatever.
Mhm.
So it was really good. It was definitely different. I didn't think of them as a pair at all. But from
Oh, really?
that now that you brought it up, I can see what you're saying. Yours was more personal.
Yeah.
His was very distinctly not personal.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think I didn't want my piece to be personal, but I found myself using myself as an example to get away from sort of the just like generalizing about everything, and just sort of to bring myself in as a subject, to ground it in some way. But like honestly, it was sort of something I was uncomfortable with from the beginning, and I think maybe that's something interesting about it, is the difference between the two pieces is that the wild, the discourse from whatever 130 years ago, there was just like much more comfort with sort of making these sort of brash, sweeping, generalized statements about the nature of things, where now I think I think there's a certain prevailing norm of the idea of someone like, I mean, like just this thing of, like art is subjective or something, that notion that like, oh, well, since it's subjective, I'm not allowed to sort of pass judgment because I can't, step on someone else's toes, because since it's subjective, well, what's the point in saying anything about it? And I think the sort of what the wild piece does so well is to underline how like subjectivity is simply, a pretext, and that, if like in the nature of art itself, like there is no objectivity, like objectivity of sort of like a rational, format for what, art aspires to do, or how it functions. Like it's not a science, there aren't objective bounds for it. Like it doesn't have any sort of grounding in the way that other disciplines do. So it is purely subjective, and that's, a starting point, not a reason to condemn the articulation of any subjectivity. Like you can't, if you can like reach, a creative, whatever, universal statement in an artwork, or a piece of criticism or something, that only comes through a lineage of your own, leaning into your own subjectivity, rather than, starting from a position of objectivity. And I think that, I mean, I'm kind of rambling now, but I think that's something like I think that's a big problem in a lot of contemporary art that I see today, is that people are afraid of their own subjectivity, or uncomfortable with the uncertainty that comes from making subjective artworks or subjective judgments. And taking recourse to a notion of objectivity in like a, you know, socio-political identity sense, sort of like leaning on these larger social categories outside of yourself to as like a as a means of sort of sidestepping the insecurity inherent in being subjective, which is, I think, shooting yourself in the foot. Like there was a line I wrote down, a man who sees both sides of the question sees absolutely nothing at all. And that makes me think specifically of a Peter Sheldall quote that I hate, which is something to the effect that when he walks into a gallery, he, instead of thinking about what he thinks about things, he would look at art and think, well, what would someone who likes this art say about this art? And I think that's an incredibly bad grounding for approaching criticism. I think because I think, I was telling a friend about that line a while ago, and he laughed and he said, like, well, what the hell does someone know about what anyone else thinks? Like, how, it's a kind of like a fallacy to pretend to inhabit the position of anyone else by like denying your own outlook to imagine what another one would be. And what Wilde, I think, emphasizes so well that I think is so integral to me is that the thing with subjectivity is that it's not sort of this, inborn, we're all different, snowflake thing. It's that everyone, has their own particularity, and the problem or the condition of a critic is that a critic is someone who has studied and has a disciplined breadth of knowledge of art or whatever, and articulates something of their understanding of these things with full knowledge that it's, limited to their own subjectivity, but that for a critic to, say anything that anyone cares to hear, I think it always relies on sort of the articulateness of the artist or of the critic, and that articulateness is sort of a expression of the like this whatever the quality of seeing or thinking about art that the critic has themselves achieved through study and a sort of a breadth of knowledge that is more than a person off the street. And I think that's a kind of another fallacy of art is this notion that, like, oh, well, since art's subjective, any person off the street has a valid knowledge of art, and that, what makes your opinion, better than someone else's or something? Why do you get to say something? And the answer is, well, one, like, it's very like the proof is in the pudding. Like, if someone wants to read your criticism, then you probably have something to say. And if you like develop a readership, it means that you're saying something in your writing that's of interest to other people, which I think is something that the conventional world of art writing has sort of abandoned wholesale. Like no one has any notion of what interesting writing looks like. It's sort of, people chugging along, doing what they think is their job, and, failing to deliver month after month. Like, when's the last, I mean, I don't know how many years you have to go back to find a good article in Art Forum. Just a little insult there on the side. But the other part of this notion is that art is not, just because art's subjective doesn't mean art isn't a discipline. Art is a discipline, and the study of art, the devoting yourself to understanding it and deepening your knowledge of it, and reading and expanding these things is a real quality. And I think that's, like, it's just like a basic thing of, people off the street, tourists get confused, if they go to MoMA, because they're like, what the hell is a Barnett Newman? Like, this is, my kid could do this, whatever. To appreciate that work, you need to contextualize the entire history of art, from the Renaissance to now, to sort of place it and see the lineage and what the artists were working through and what was radical about it. Because if you don't have that information, then it is natural to scoff at these things. And like Wilde says it well, just in the line, like, an appreciation of Milton is the reward of consummate scholarship. And I think that's a really important notion, and one that I think is really, to me, the thing that makes me continue to be interested in art at all, is that the study of art, reading books about art, sort of having an artist that you don't like very much, and then reading something where learning about this artist makes you see the artist differently or more deeply or more expansively or something, that that's to me, the greatest reward of art, which I don't think is, I think historically speaking, regarding critics, that has not been the focus, because I think the normative quality of an art critic, at least through the 20th century, and even, even, from Diderot to whatever, through to now, I think every sort of critic, their position has been, engaging with their moment and seeing the new art around them and, championing it and knowing, whatever, Greenberg and Pollock and, the Donald Judd's own criticism, sort of championing his own position, and that there was a certain like contemporaneous focus where, the documenting the new thing, what's happening now, and sort of reacting to it and explaining it, or, as it's happening before it's been sort of codified and historicized. That's what critics were doing. I mean, aside from, the sort of New York Times, like, Upper East Side couples wanting to go to galleries and like going to the place that got 50 words written about it or something. But I think that's sort of the real contemporary issue that's new, that I think grounds my stance as a critic, as something different from the past, is that I I don't think there is a, you know, I don't have a thing to champion. I mean, I know some young artists that I think are making good work, but you know, they're so marginal within the art culture. There's not this sort of infrastructure for like me to support the artist's career to grow, and me to be, you know, the artist who writes about this type of thing. Like that social function is, I think, decimated. And, you know, art is so bad now that I think I think that's, you know, sort of my overarching position on the status of contemporary art, is that the sort of like avant-garde modernist model of new things coming out and new iterations, new sort of aesthetics, new articulations of stuff, just simply has ground down almost to a total stop. And, you know, the question is why? And my sort of glib answer is basically implied in Wild, which is just that, you know, this sort of development of the like self-development of your own sort of perception of art and your engagement with the notion of what art is, and sort of a engaged reflection on art in a historical context that places the present in relation to the past, so that you can reflect on the present versus the past to understand its particularities. Because I think that's the trap we're in, which Wilde points out somewhere, which is that if you are just, you know, if you don't have any connection to the past, if you don't know your history, then you're just subjected to the present. You're not engaged with it. You're just on, you know, the treadmill. And if you want to, you know, actually engage with the present substantively in your work, you need a self-consciousness to recognize contextually what that is. And I think that is something that basically, you know, throughout the 20th century was just taken for granted, because that's what like education was. That's what like learning about art in school was. And now it's not. And now, you know, the historical position is this sort of avant-gardism, innovation sort of, or like how to sell your work mentality that I think is just sputtering out. And so, you know, this notion of sort of reflection and deepening of understanding is, I think, the baseline that we've sort of forgotten. And without it, you know, I don't think art can really amount to much. I don't know. Anyone have any questions?
Yeah, to me, that's related to what Wilde was talking about in this compelling way. I thought that the creative impulse is sort of an impulse of imitation, and without adding the ingredient of criticality, yeah, it just amounts to the treadmill of imitating kind of mindlessly. Yeah, I was sort of convinced by that, you know, that little like pithy dialogue between Gilbert and Ernest. Yeah, and I think to me that just adding that ingredient of criticality connects to what I hear you saying about understanding the context, historical or otherwise, that you're situating yourself in.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's funny, like I don't what was I gonna say? Just this just the making without a notion of self-criticality. It's there's actually moments of it that remind me a lot of what like I associate with like Deleuze talking about art, which is odd, but just just these he kind of near the end starts getting into these notions of form and the the relationship between feeling and form in art, and that feeling is it's not a thing of like I have a feeling and now I gotta paint it. Like you like whatever, looked at the sunset. You're like, wow, that sunset made me feel a way, so I'm gonna put that feeling down. It's a extremely, fraught and confusing dialectic of sort of navigating the space between the your experience of life and your knowledge of feeling and phenomena in the world, and navigating that through the formal qualities of the thing you're actually doing. So like, and that the reason it reminds me of Deleuze is something he says a lot in a lot of places is this notion of literature, and he says writing literature is not about I have loved, or I have my grandma died and I felt sad, and that sadness drove me to write a book, and that is how I got the feelings to make a book. It's that you're a writer and you learn how to, through the form of writing and your means of the medium you work in, you find a way to instigate or to embed feelings within the thing itself, which I'm of the belief is generally or often more determined by the thing itself than it is by your sort of guiding it. And in that sense, like, I think there's an interesting sort of near parallel between criticism and art, in the sense that I think making art, you're really a medium of phenomena that you hopefully bring into existence. Something is conveyed through the thing, and that thing that you're conveying, you're not really in control of that. You have a relationship to it, you're involved with it, but the ability to sort of like express something is it's not luck, but it's you're capturing or like transferring sort of experiential phenomena into the work itself, that is not sort of I woke up today and I wanted to paint something sad, so and here's the sad thing. It's far more abstract than that. And then so the parallel with criticism is that a critic, you're left with a you have a thing, you have a subject, and that subject has, hopefully those feelings or phenomena that an artist puts out onto into the artwork. And a critic's job is to, in some sense, recognize or give voice to what it is that that work is doing. And so just, which is just to say that in both cases, you're acting as a sort of transference of phenomena that's not located either in the maker or the viewer or the critic. It's sort of just and the nature of those mediations are very different. But how do I click on you for the, or do I just say, Andrea, you have a question? Yeah.
That works.
Yeah.
Hi there.
Hi.
I was listening to you, and I just one quick question.
Mhm.
I don't know if it's getting off topic, but you mentioned about, the relationship to history.
Mhm.
If you're not in conversation with history, then you're out of, you're not, the work's not contextualized, and it's hard to, and I'm thinking a lot about history vis-a-vis what's going on today, and
Mhm.
the ability of people missing out on history to understand complex geopolitical problems.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on the fact that perhaps not wanting to know history is a function of wanting to rewrite this history or recreate this history, that it's more inclusive and has other voices, and which is important, but how do we work with the fact that, yes, we need to retell some stories and we need more voices, more faces, more identities out there, but without killing everything that came before, because there is still intellect and knowledge that is, although it is probably colonized, all those labels that people are trying to navigate, this erasure creates, I think, what you're describing, which is a lot of art not being good.
Mhm.
Do you know, or your inability, this desire to crack, to go from one side to the other, is resulting in something that's what you're describing. What are your
Yep.
thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's, yeah, good question. The easiest line to start with is just, the kind of cliche of, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I think that's, of course, true. And it makes me think of a couple lines. There's so the filmmakers Strobe Houillet, it's a Jean-Marie Strobe and Danielle Houillet, like a French duo. They in interviews, they would always very literary, and they would drop lines a lot. And a couple of their favorite quotes are, there's one from Walter Benjamin and another from Charles Péguy that basically say the same thing, which is just that the like revolution is not only the jump into the future, but also the tiger's leap into the past, or that progress is also the remembrance of old things. And so I think that's a thing, is just that this notion of sort of development or progress or whatever that people aspire towards, you need like to progress, you sort of just need like basic knowledge and competence or expertise, or you need to know, you should develop, and that development needs grounding, and that grounding necessarily comes from the past, because it can't come from the future or I think that's just like physics. And like I think just this thing of like the an aesthetic education or something, like that you develop a familiarity with phenomena and life and experience through art, I think that art offers far more experience than we can get through living, and that sort of process of development is what can bring us to a self-awareness or a self-criticism or a just a deepening of experience that I think if you are focused wholeheartedly on the present and changing the present into the future without sort of these past contexts, then I think you're just gonna like butt your head into a wall. And I think the larger thing that I've been thinking about a lot is so I recently read T.J. Clarke's Farewell to an Idea, which is basically his critique of modernism as a failure, meaning that modernism, aspired to reinvent society wholesale, and it didn't work because you can't break the past. These ruptures, these developments of art in the 20th century were very productive. They did a lot of, they reconfigured things, but there's a certain like baseline of sort of how reality is. There's certain, I mean, whatever, like I'm no expert on this stuff, but I think just if you've studied anything about sort of what happened with like the Soviet Union trying to abolish money or something, like these things, like there's just structures in. I think in the 20th century people thought there were a lot less structures to society than what we are now aware of. Like there's this sort of deep strata of making life function that if you kind of try to dig it up and throw it out, it's going to cause 100,000 more problems. So so it becomes less a problem of sort of like fixing it or changing it entirely than sort of adapting or working with these things to do things well, because I mean I'm very much a political pessimist, so but that we don't have to get into political parties and Joe Biden or whatever, but but I do think that this sort of it's not like I'm like a critical of the revolutionary impulse or something. I think there's just very unfortunate realities that have been revealed in the last 50 years about how mutable society is and how difficult it is to change these things, and that sort of just that goodwill and a revolutionary impulse isn't enough. I think that's actually, so that's my kind of big belief is that but between sort of a whatever a aesthetic intuitive understanding of the world and like a rational categorical understanding of the world, like the only thing that can truly like mediate reality productively is like just like an intelligence, like being like whatever, like a example would be just like the most like whatever you take like you're like, okay, I'm going to start a new country and it's going to be like Marxist and we're going to do everything differently and we're going to do it really well, and you have everything figured out really well, but fundamentally, like for it to work, all these sort of bureaucrats or whatever that you're using to run the country, like you need intelligence, you need people who are self-critical and self-aware and thinking very hard about these problems to deal with them and to to, you know, make it work. Because if you have sort of, you know, lazy, dumb, you know, someone who's just like not aware, then they're going to gum it up. And you can have the most perfect system in the world. And if it's not being done well, then you're screwed no matter what. So, all right, let's do another one. Antonio?
It's funny that you brought the notion of like this modernizing impulse or
Mhm.
this notion of progress. And I think that your criticism of contemporary criticism is very acute in many things. But one thing that you didn't mention in your first introduction, and I wonder what you think, is I wonder to what degree this death of criticism is related to like the fall of a teleological notion of progress in art. Because if you don't have like a clear, if you're not really convinced, or you don't have, like you don't defend a particularly strong position of where to go, then it's harder to champion a particular artist, and perhaps therefore it's also harder to do criticism. I don't know, like I was just wondering in having your take on this. Yeah, like now progress, what is it? Like it's a bit confusing, and how do we do criticism based on that?
Yeah. No, I think it is a very real problem that you know, it's hard to ground, you know, where the issue comes from, like the, you know, commercialization of art and just sort of, you know, I kind of like in a vague sense think, you know, the broadly like the 60s and 70s, you know, was kind of like a high point of sort of self-aware, self-critical, like very high intellectual programs in, you know, art theory and art making, and that it's just sort of been like a downhill slide from there, and sort of the only things that have been keeping it up were sort of the you know, exhaust fumes from, you know, for instance, when, you know, there used to be robust public funding for the arts in the United States, like these. So, but which is basically, you know, another way to put it easily is, you know, I often say to like friends that, you know, I don't think art's going to get better in New York until rents drop. And you know, what that sort of means is it's just these things where it's like, you know, like a flourishing artistic culture where new things are being created, and, you know, something that there is out there to champion, I think is to some degree just a question of like how you know, robust the, you know, institutions or the cultural economic system is to, and how nourishing it is for sort of artists to refine themselves and to develop their perspectives and their work. And that's the thing is the contemporary art world is like completely hostile to this sort of notion of like self-development and progress. Like, you know, the model for the last 20 years or so has been just like come up with a style, like a little trick that you can label your own, like I'm the frog painter or something. You know, hopefully you're 25 or under, and then you just kind of like God forbid your gallerist will drop you and, you know, blacklist you if you try to break that formula. And so So all this is just to say that, this idea of sort of like the belief in like a, teleological notion of progress in art is, I think, I think it could come back if the systems were better, but now it's just every single edifice is against it. So it's extremely hard to even imagine these sorts of things coming back. But, I don't know, it's just like, I think, there's more than whispers, there's rumblings that the art market is sort of having its first big sort of crumble in a few decades, and I wonder if, sort of a market correction will probably won't make things any better because given the state of the world, but the glut of easy money has been very sort of anti-progressive for art in every way. So I don't know, did that answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, I would have other things to say, but one thing that, like you mentioned Greenberg, no?
Yeah.
And he could only do what he did to Pollock because he really believed that Pollock was like solving 500 years of art, like of painting, like in a single piece, like he could synthesize it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know, like and like you, like I find Greenberg really interesting, although like it's very problematic in many senses.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'll think
Yeah.
about your answer and then I get back to you.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting, and this is actually in a reading for, I think it's maybe for the third week, but it's an article from his later lectures in like the early 70s or something. I think it's just called Art Criticism, but he mentions like later on in it that like a friend said to him like, oh, it's interesting how like your idea of modern art has shifted, and it's you no longer think of it as a break but as something that fundamentally continues all the it's a continuation of sort of the aesthetic notions that have always been present in art. And he says like, oh, I didn't actually realize it, but then when I looked back I realized that my position had changed. And so I don't know, I guess my thoughts aren't really settled on where all this goes and what all this means with just the sort of I've been preoccupied with sort of wanting to, but not yet having had the time to think through sort of like what sort of the death of modernism and even of postmodernism, like what that implies. But I think, I think what even Greenberg says in that short piece has some suggestion of it, that just like a notion of sort of, I wouldn't say they're sort of like absolute timeless categories or something, but just the sort of the material qualitative content of art is timeless. And what that means for art now is something I still want to think about. Aurelie, is that how you said?
Yes, Aurélie. Hi. I suppose I made a note in your own piece around, well, yeah, you spoke about the critic and the cynic, and then also in Wild Space, there's a line that says, when people talk to us about themselves, they are nearly always interesting, and if one could shut them up when they become wearisome, they could they would be perfect, absolutely. So I suppose I'm interested in the process of writing
Mhm.
and obviously subjectivity. And so I wonder, how do you navigate that line, or like how do you sieve through, I suppose, everything that's happening in you when you sort of, you look at a show, you look at a work of art, or you consider an artist's work. And so how do you articulate and deliver a critic that is not, just self-indulgent or judgmental, or like, how do you cut through to sort of I don't know. I think that's probably where the talent is, or
Sure.
like a lot of work. But yeah, how do you do that with your work?
Yeah. I think that's I mean, yeah, it's a valid, very, very important question. And I think I think like whenever I see, there's been at least, a dozen copycat websites that are sort of openly or implicitly trying to do my format. And there's the one that I do like a lot is called the Midwest Art Quarterly. And the guy who runs that, I've met him, and he's a smart, very serious, kind of academic guy. And I mean, it's insane, actually. He lives in St. Louis and he reviews every art show in St. Louis, which is like why it's quarterly, because, there's 15 art shows in 3 months as opposed to, 50 a week in New York. And, just that he has to engage with, art that I would never bother with. Like, so I think, but to go to but anyway, the reason I brought that up is just that, I always look at these sort of new kind of websites that kind of copy me, like or there's this new one in LA called Diva Corp, and it's very explicitly trying to do what I do. And they've been, I assume it's a woman based on diva, but they've been, a lot of my kind of rambling, but these kind of copy cats they've all fizzled out pretty quickly. And that's sort of like a open question of the issue I'm bringing up, which is just that, but the Diva Corp, the only reason I mentioned is just that they started at the beginning of June, and they've been very Diva Corp. Let me actually just look it up. Yes, divacorp.net. And so they've been very productive in that time. I think they've probably done 60 reviews or something. They've been going to a lot of galleries, but there's this sort of thing of just being, like, I read it all because I'm curious and I want there to be people who are writing interesting criticism. And but the thing is, even though they're like their grading is more harsh than mine, and they're trying to be very critical, there's no real like bite to it, because they don't, like, they'll do like kind of flippant insulting things, but I think their insult is usually just like, oh, I think they're just trying to sell art. And it's like, well, yeah, you could write that review for every art show in the United States. And when they do like something, there's not really, I can't tell why, or like what their conception of what good art is. They don't seem to have a sort of frame of reference. And so I think, basically, I mean, regarding your question, it's sort of like the answer is I don't know how I write like in a way that anyone wants to read it. And I certainly don't know how to teach it to anyone. But I do think that this notion of sort of developing a greater conception of what art is in general is what underpins it. And that, like, if I have anything I would point to as the source of how I write about art or something, it would be that I have a very, I spent a long time sort of just obsessively thinking about trying to work out what artistic quality is, and having a, sort of a personal anecdote is, a lot of my like high school and college friends and stuff, before I started hanging out with artists, they'd always be like, "You're too critical. Why are you so critical of everything? Why are you so, like, you stop being so negative or whatever." And I'd always be like, "Well, too critical for what? Like, too critical for you." I'm not like, I think that's the line between sort of criticality and cynicism, is that I've always been very stringent in my standards about things in the world. But a cynic is sort of this sort of encroaching sort of whatever infection of sort of disillusionment with everything, where you kind of dislike everything because you mutate your own subjective view of things to dislike everything. And just whatever, just mean-spiritedness or something. Whereas what I think I've always intuitively for a long time been able to do is to be really a harsh judge of things, but to use that energy to sort of to keep the, the not the clarity, but like the keeping my standards clean by making them very high, and to nourish sort of my reverence of art in the abstract by only being satisfied by art that meets particular standards. And I think, on some level, I think it's just, when I think back to that stuff, it's sort of like it's almost like common sense that I ended up being a critic, because I just have like the temperament to think things through that way. And I think that's not, I think other art critics who write for magazines or something mostly just like went to NYU for journalism or something and just kind of got a job or something. And like, I wonder often with other critics, like have they ever read criticism that they were like inspired by? Like, because I don't, it strains credulity to think that they have, because I don't know why they would be writing the way they do. I guess the last thing I'll say though is that something that's very, I think, integral to my own writing process for like my short criticism is that I write substantively everything in my reviews, like in my notes app on my phone while I'm in the gallery. And that, I think that immediacy of having the thing in front of me and really just sort of like journaling the way I feel in the space is very important. And if I have a more complex thought that I can't write down, then I can, flesh it out later. But I'm actually very sort of like thrown off if like a gallerist chats me up, or if I go somewhere with a friend and I have to like remember how I felt later. That that it's much harder for me to do that way. So I think that sort of immediacy, and I bring that up because I think for the assignments, I think that's maybe a quality that's important for for what you guys are going to try to write, is that this sort of like trying to be very like concrete about your own experience of a thing by sort of as close as possible writing down your reaction to something like in the moment that you are actually reacting to it is, in my experience, very helpful. Arena?
Hello. I don't have a question, but I have some kind of desire to discuss part of my experience with critical art. And for what we were discussing, that we need to go to past and we need for the progress. I'm thinking about it in like expertise levels. My experience in Russia, that a lot of art critics are not very, I don't know, educated. You don't have to have PhD, but you have to know something about something. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm writing about Moscow conceptualism, and there is there's a presupposition that there is a lot of works about Moscow conceptualism, and namely collective actions, one of the main group of my interests. And but all of this literature is very, as I think, low quality in the critique of in its critique and in its judgment. And I have actually like anecdote about that that someone that 3 months ago didn't know when was the first performance of this group. Then 3 months later, he writes something critical about the effects of this group. Like you spend almost no time, and you already an expert. And the question is how you how you find this balance between going too deep and to be an expert in something, and being too shallow, because of course if you engage in, you must read something, anything, just to know the context. But how much is enough? It's not a concrete question, but maybe a topic for discussion. I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. In the notion of, maybe being, too close to your subject, or sort of like not being able to critique it, and sort of, maybe being like more of the art historian perspective, where sort of you're like, I don't know, like some of the like weaknesses of the like October magazine people, like that there'd sort of be you have a thesis about the nature of critical conceptual art, and then you sort of say like, this anti-aesthetic political critique in art is good art. That's what I believe in. Anything that's not, like anything that recognizes aesthetics as bourgeois or something, like these categories are what is good art. And like, this is like, for instance, like a very, that's like a very glib, like, it's not very serious, sort of cliff notes of what I vaguely understand, like, to be the weaknesses of like Benjamin Buclow's project. Like I think he's a good writer, and I think he championed a lot of good artists, but I think there's some very weird, sort of obvious, blind spots that he has, and like, so I think a good example for it or something is that he sort of tried to approach art being good categorically, and he sort of like, I don't know, like I think, I don't even know this for a fact because I haven't read any of it, but I think the way he writes about Gerhard Richter is, what I do know from like watching interviews and stuff is that like he and Richter have been friends for 50 years, but they like disagree like incredibly passionately on how Buchlow sees Richter, because Richter grew up in East Germany and can't stand any sort of like Marxism or leftism, and Buchlow can't talk about any art he likes outside of that context. So they obviously disagree on it. But the problem, I think, in this viewpoint, aside from sort of the general notion of just not, so I feel like his approach is sort of a sublimation of his attempt at sublimating like his own personal biases into objectivity, rather than to like negate any sort of subjectivity. And I think that's, just sort of short-sighted or like, kind of silly in to my point of view. And then like, it also gets into a problem, like you sort of see his blind spots in the sense that like, he was a huge supporter of Daniel Buren, and then Buren, has since sort of sold out his, strident critical conceptual conceits and just, works with, does design for like fashion shows, and he's just kind of, he's compromised his whole sort of project. And so Buchlow sort of like rejected him. And I've just like seen him sort of bring up this question of like, well, this is the question of like, why do some of these critical artists that I like stay critical, and why do some of them sell out? And like he could sort of brings it up as like a rhetorical, impossible to answer question. And it's just like, no, he just sold out. Like that's always on the table. That's always a problem that all artists have to deal with. And I think to me is one of the great problems that I sort of see as one of the baseline things for an artist's career is like, how do you continue to work without becoming complacent and repetitive and losing your spark or whatever. And Buren, I think a lot of conceptualists sort of, and minimalists sort of, the stridency of their initial position, like, like I like Donald Judd on some level, but like also he just like made the same boxes for what, 40 years, and like there's not sort of like a you can't continue making the same boxes from a fabricator, year after year and like not sort of be spinning your wheels. But anyway, the other side of sort of this notion of the sort of non-critical nature of a lot of like art writing and sort of these historians and researchers who sort of sidestep criticality and are just sort of trying to be impartial is, I mean, I think to some degree it's simply just a matter of the disciplines and the messiness of judgment when you're trying to be a historian. But I think also there's a thing of like, literally, I think, you know, Greenberg was such an asshole that aesthetic judgment was just turned into a no-no for, you know, basically every generation of art critics from, you know, the 60s to now. And like, you know, it's like, I think, like if I didn't go through any sort of like academic art education system, and I imagine it might have been drilled into me that, you know, aesthetic judgment is wrong and that you have to be objective or polemical and you're not really allowed to sort of just judge. But I didn't, and so I threw my roundabout, you know, self-education in art. Like it strikes me as natural that of course judgment is like the grounds for one's engagement with art, and that's very much against the norm as far as I know with art writing. So I think like it's really just like it has been a faux pas for, you know, a good half century, whereas I think, you know, like, I don't know if you read something like Walter Pater, who's mentioned a number of times in the wild, like I think there's much more attunement sort of to the aesthetic as a qualitative phenomena that he's willing to talk about. Whereas a lot of, you know, 20th century writers, I think, didn't want to deal with the messiness of it. Does that answer your question?
I wanted to add that 1 second. The notion about you said something about the death of critics. We can say something about the death of contemporary art, because I think a lot of us understands that a lot of artists don't know what they do, and they need curators and art critics to tell them. And a lot of artists are helpless without conceptualization of others and institutional affiliations. And if a lot of if artists cannot create concepts and art critic is dead, we don't have a lot of hope.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what was I going to say about that? Just that I think, you know, that that's something that's extremely difficult about the making art today, is that not having sort of a, you know, now that like movements are dead, like art has been relativized in like a historical continuum where, you know, people think they're free to do whatever they want and it's probably fine to just be doing anything, and that like, you know, that the all, you know, all rules are called off and history is, it's like, yeah, like the end of history type notion. And I think the difficulty is that that's false. And if you like try really hard, I think that this sort of like continuum of the history of art can be sort of sewn back together, and that you can then come up with, ideas that are adequate to the present in art and to sort of, revive or just to make work that has some sort of depth of content or freshness or whatever you want to call it in it. And I think it's just that these, especially, institutions and educators and galleries and other artists and stuff, like it's sort of like a kind of a conspiracy to deny that is the case, and that like that we aren't free to do anything, and that the reacting to the present in a adequate way is necessary on some level to like making work that has any value to it. We go to the next one, Jones.
Hey, so I absolutely loved the wild text, but I think I want to like slightly play the part of a cynic here. But so I love the text because it had a little bit of something for everybody. Like, I mean, it gave there are moments where it gave I mean, I feel like it's a text that in its bits and pieces can bother everybody and cater to everybody, and it's very dialectic in that way, and it's beautiful. The form is incredible, and a lot of things that he talks about in terms of if he's kind of creating a theory through the whole thing, he employs it. Like, it's very decorative. It's kind of like, it's like an exhibition in a text. It's wonderful. But going back to like it's also very it's non-committal in a lot of ways. And I want to go back to that point. I mean, I wanted to respond to Jorge, the critic as artist. So yeah, so I want to go back to the thing about like, I mean, what you was talking about earlier in terms of progress, because like there are two viewpoints that is being like kind of placed. One is of the fact that, art as being a tool to kind of like vicariously experience, and by vicariously experiencing, be able to kind of cultivate yourself in a wider sense than what lived experience can kind of like give you. So that's kind of like seen at a point. At the same time, I mean, it almost seems to like nudge towards like, he's trying, like, I mean, art kind of becomes a way of creating like, Plato's philosopher kings. Like, I mean, so it's like in that direction. But at the same time, like, I mean, so one would think that every art critic should get into policy making. That's what I would imagine. But then again, he says that like, you're not supposed to do anything with this knowledge, because teaching is going to hinder your own growth. And the result of your actions are going to essentially be like, you don't know where it's going to go. Like, I mean, eventually it's going to be stripped of its essence, so to speak. So considering all of these things, I mean, what it seems to finally imply, like, this whole cultivation is for cultivation's sake, and it is a self-indulgence. And in that, are we kind of like removing ourselves too far from material realities? Because those exist. Like, I mean, if we are studying histories, it is a history of violence. There is a lot to want for. So do we just vicariously live through artworks and like just leave it at that? Is that the point of the text? Like,
Yeah,
I don't think that has an answer, but yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, on some level, I think it's just there's a certain emphasis on that. That is just sort of the nature of you know, the decadence of his era and his social world and stuff. The this sort of dandyism was in fashion. So like, and you know, of course, it's intended, I think, as a provocation. And you know, it's like I think there's a great line, I think it's from Borges on Wild, where he says he's an extremely profound person, going to great pains to appear to be a frivolous person. And yeah, so he's definitely, you know, playing with this frivolity and this you know, like yeah, you should do nothing. Like, yeah, that's the best thing to do. And you know, so I do think there's definitely a tongue-in-cheek level to it. But I guess the two things about it is one is that, you know, I think what's that? Can't remember. It's some poet or something. Like I think maybe around the time of Wilde, Keats or someone, just about how, you know, everyone like deserving of greatness or office or something, that like everyone adequate to be, you know, I don't know, whatever. I'm over, I don't remember the quote and I'm over editorializing. Basically just that people who shouldn't be confident are, and everyone who should be confident isn't. That like everyone who is cultivated and should be, you know, running things, is too self-aware and too self-critical and too sort of hampered by their own awareness to do those things. And then the people who are, you know, ignorant narcissists are the ones who actually do those things because they're too full of themselves to realize that they're not at all adequate to the job. And so I think that, you know, I think in that sense, this sort of support of this idea of self-cultivation to no end is, I think, a serious psychological fact that I don't really know if there's sort of any basic way around it. And what was the other part? That oh yeah, so I think on the other hand, there's also like some truth in sort of like, you know, be the change you want to see in the world or whatever. Oh, Yeats, thank you. And you know, just simply by doing what you're doing, that it will, you know, be influential to other people. And so, you know, it's just like a thing of, you know, whatever, that like Wilde was a idle decadent, but his writing endures, and the writing is an example that we're talking about now. And so in that sense, his writing about idleness is, you know, praxis by us reading it now and learning something from it. And I think, you know, that's sort of my position on what I do is, you know, that all I can do is hope that by my labors that I'll encourage a sort of revival of an art critical discourse that will be productive for art, like improving in some way, hopefully. Is that, what do you think? Maybe. All right, I'm gonna run to the bathroom real quick. Don't go anywhere. Okay, sorry about that. All right, Kat, you can talk, and then I think maybe we should talk about the assignment, because I think we should talk about it as a group, because I don't really know. I kind of pulled that assignment out of my ass, so I think I want to hear what you guys think about it.
Sure. Yeah. So I have only been writing criticism for about like 9 months. And so I'm very much like an infant in that sense. And I am, sort of muddling my way through different lengths and approaches and trying to find something that feels, as we've read in Wild and in your piece, truthful, authentic, individual, personally, like that expresses my personality or integrates it in some way. And I suppose what interested me in taking this workshop with you is less so that, as we've seen, there are lots of mimics of your style, which you have identified as your approach to writing criticism, and that is not my interest in aping that format per se. But what I am interested in is getting at sort of like what makes it so arousing and fresh and often shocking and exciting, And I think that's why you sort of like garnered all of this attention and, love and derision, I'm sure, and everything. And, obviously there's a lot of, as we've talked about and read in Wild, there's a lot of personality, there's a lot of sort of like honesty, integrity involved in that. And I was interested, and one thing that I was interested if you sort of had, a thought on as we think about, maybe what more makes for good criticism, less so than like what I would say is maybe like more particular to you and this sort of like, I don't mean to call your criticism negative, but sort of like your approach. I'm sorry, I'm trying to form a thought here. I guess what I am looking at is like this sort of like Socratic method that Wilde uses in his dialogue. And then obviously it's like also very romantic. It appeals to sort of like these Greek ideals as well, looks back and exalts them as sort of the birthplace, the founders of critical thought. And it seems to me sort of like in dialogue, maybe there is some kind of way forward for criticism, which might might explain what we find lacking so frequently in art and criticism today. Which is not to say there's not like a conversation, because there are like conversations happening constantly between, between subjects, but rather there's some like inherent tensions or or actual argument, both occurring within art that we would be able to engage with, or within criticism. I guess that's all I had to contribute, but I thought maybe that would spark some kind of something.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think I mean, that's really, I think
and it's and that is like, the Socratic method being like very anti-academic, anti-rhetoric, which Wilde also talks about. It's like, God forbid I should have to sit next to somebody who tries to teach me something.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, that's that is sort of the question that we have to deal with, because it's like, I don't really I think that is kind of the nature of these having copycats or something, is that people like, it reminds me of like this is random, but it just like reminds me of something like I saw for some reason one of the Chapo Trap House guys say one time, was just like how like listeners get so mad at podcasters because podcasting is like, looks like, the easiest job in the world. It's like the simplest thing to do. Like, so everyone's like, I can do that. But actually, it's like an extremely rare skill that you can talk, extemporaneously with two of your friends and make it interesting and have depth to it, like every week or whatever. And so, which is just to say that, like, I think based on my example, a lot of people have used what I do as a model, when maybe that's not where their talent lies, or they confuse the model itself with the content of what I'm doing, which is, I think, what I would say about the Wilde dialogue, Socratic dialogue thing, is that I think that sort of gets at a critique I have of a lot of art that sort of contents itself to deal with just aesthetic signifiers and sort of just like a baseline of the style, or sort of like, oh, I like the Renaissance, so I make paintings that look kind of like the Renaissance, but they're like kind of abstract or something. Like, just sort of this confusion of conflating a formal style that is historicized and localizable, and confusing that with the content of the work itself. And so this problem of content is hard to, it's hard to sort of be able to dredge something up in a piece of writing. And like in my piece, I talk about Robert Christgau, and he was sort of my early influence of just someone, and it wasn't even like, I mean, I spent 10 years in denial that I was going to be a critic, until I came around to the idea. But I was always sort of drawn to his articulateness, just that what he said sort of said something. Like, I mean, like, I think like part of the reason I ended up down this road is that I was downloading music online and stuff, and like learning about music mainly like through college and stuff. I was mainly interested in like getting into weirder and weirder music, and like I always kind of wanted someone else's take on it to like know what I should think, or like I'm like, oh, I've heard about this band, what's Robert Christgau's favorite album? And, you know, I don't even like his taste that much. I don't really agree with most of what he says, but there's still like this excitement I have to this day, where if I like, you know, whatever, decide to listen to some band from the 70s or something that I haven't heard before, I'm like, oh, cool, I can look that up on Robert Christgau's website and see what he said about all their albums and like learn something about his perception of that band's like arc of their discography. And it's really insane how much, you know, sort of content there is in that. Because, you know, if you like, what I learned very early on was, you know, I'd read him write 4 sentences on something, and then I'd go to Pitchfork, and I'd read, you know, something 10 times the length or more, and like I'd have nothing from it at the end. Or like if you go on whatever Letterboxd to rate your music or something, like a lot of people don't get that they're not saying anything. And so this notion of saying something is, I think, an extremely elusive and difficult thing that I have no idea how to like. I don't think you can impart that to someone else. I think that's, you know, like in the Wild, there's the line about like anything worth knowing is something you can't teach someone. But I do think, you know, like I remember, and I meant this as a joke, like I came across someone who was doing like a new criticism blog, and I didn't think it was very good. So like I posted it on Twitter, and I said like, come on, you guys, like stop it. Like, don't start trying to be like a web critic like until you're 30. And what I'm, you know, I didn't like act, I'm not like ageist or something, but what I mean is that like that this sort of to make your writing or articulate, you need to sort of, you know, foster and develop your own subjectivity to the point where your subjective opinion of something is capable of saying something at all. And that, you know, just this notion that like an idea or like a thought is actually a rare thing. And to muster a statement on something that is that does something for someone who reads it. Like, I think, you know, I've just like seen, I don't know, you know, someone like yells at me on Instagram about how I'm like, you know, sexist because I didn't like a Cindy Sherman show. And then says like, oh, you probably like Carl Andre. Like, as if it's like, oh, I don't like a woman artist, so I must love a man who killed his wife. Like, you know, it's just like, you know, it's very simple binary levels of thinking. But like, you know, that I was like looking at that person's Instagram after they like blew up at me, and then they posted, you know, a review of something on like 4 columns, and all it is like a flat description of the show, and like maybe a slight bit of historical context that's maybe like 5% more than what you get from the press release. And this person was like, oh, well, this is like, now this is art criticism. And I just like can't fathom what they get from it, unless it's, you know, just some basic like people like patting themselves on the back for feeling like cultivated by learning about an artist they haven't heard of or something. Like you know, I think, you know, this, yeah, I think, you know, there's, I'm like cycling through like memories of, you know, like wanting to be a writer or something, and like, you know, hearing stories from authors that, you know, like I learned to write by typing out an entire book I liked on a typewriter, and like the physical act of typing it taught me something in a very abstract sense about writing. Or like you memorize a short story and then you read it 10 times, then you read it 10 more times, you have it memorized, then you like read it twice as many times as you have after you have it memorized. And then you like leave it somewhere else and then you try to write it. And like, then when you see what you did versus what they did. And so I think is the thing about a writer having a subjective perspective, is that like subjectivity is itself not very much, like outside of this development, that you don't bring something to the table inherently. You have to work really hard over a long period of time to have anything to say. And the thing is that to have something to say as a subject, like you get that from learning from other people and from reading and from exposure to the world around you. So in that sense, the development of subjectivity is just sort of an entirely intersubjective phenomenon that isn't actually like inherently located in yourself. Like, show me the philosopher who isn't fundamentally, the student of the philosophers that came before them. Like these things are outside of you. And so like the ability to articulate something about art, I think is really, it's closer to like experience than it is to subjectivity. And that's kind of my concern with this is that particularly short form criticism, I think, is extremely difficult to do it's extremely difficult to sort of like instill it with something that's of interest to other people. So we should talk about the assignments, but first, Luindo, is that how you say it? Did you have a question?
Yes, it's Luendo. So I guess my question is about the economics of it all. I'm not sure, and I'm in South Africa, so I don't know what your media scene is like, but like we've had a lot of newspapers, go fully digital, and then they're going fully digital, they go smaller teams. And like the biggest cuts has definitely been around like the art writing and the cultural writers. So we don't really have professional critics at this stage because they're, who's going to employ them? And I guess it's a question about like where would, being an art critic fall in the like broader media landscape, and what does it mean to have, like 10 years ago, we had a lot of art desks and culture writers and like Sunday papers and some people specialized in music, other people specialized in art. But the reality of it, like right now, it's, you'll be very lucky if you get a journalist at your exhibition. So, in this, like, okay, they're not necessarily talented, or they're not necessarily, being critical of what they're writing, but like what happens when they're gone? Because that's kind of the way in which we're moving. And well, people will always write, obviously, but to have like consistent art writing is not something that's possible. So what, how do we navigate that kind of future, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, good fucking question. I mean, so that's the thing. It's like what I've done is the only reason I can do it at all is because I literally have a blog. It's just my personal project. And you know, I started doing it because I had moved to New York 8 months before, and I had a part-time online job and a part-time job at a liquor store, and I could do the online job at the liquor store. So I was barely making ends meet from part-time work because I doubled up on my two, you know, $15 an hour part-time jobs. So I was like, so I had free time, which is rare enough. And I was making, you know, I wasn't making much money, but I was paying my rent. And I was like, well, I want to get better at writing. So I'll start doing this criticism thing as just like an exercise. And so I did it for maybe 5 months before COVID lockdowns. And then post lockdown, you know, once galleries opened up again, then I really had a lot of free time to go to galleries, and I had some more money. So I, you know, it was like, basically my point is just that I'm completely independent. Like I make $500 a month on my Patreon, and I've received like a grant for the last 2 years. That's just like a personal grant from like a artist. And like, because infrastructurally the entire like art criticism journalism world, I think, is, you know, completely sclerotic and dead and incapable of producing writers that can produce things that people care about. And it's interesting because I've met a few, you know, head editors of large magazines, and every one of them has openly, you know, said to me very explicitly, and I think earnestly, that they know that their writing is boring and not very good, and that they, you know, wish they had more talented writers to pull from and people with more sort of divisive critical opinions, but they just don't have the you know, talent base. And, you know, and I think they're earnest about it, but also I think that being an editor at a major art magazine means that you are sort of a cog within a much larger economic system that is not going to let you actually fix those problems. It's not going to let you make a, you know, hairpin turn or whatever, flip things around so that you start supporting real criticism and critics who deserve the name, who aren't just writers or journalists. That critic is just like the conventional term for it. So I mean, you know, I like, it's the series of lucky sort of kind of connections of things that allowed me to so far make money doing what I do or make ends meet has been like an extremely thin tightrope. And it's, you know, near impossible that I could imagine, like, you know, my story is not a model for people to follow suit, because it's not like a viable way of doing things. You know, I'm not going to be some like whatever entrepreneur guy. It's like, you know, just start writing criticism and, you know, start a Patreon and you'll make it. You know, like it's basically impossible. But everyone also hates the state of things. No one likes it. I think that was my shock when I started writing, and it started catching on, is that like I knew what I thought I wanted criticism to look like, and I was surprised to find how widespread the consensus was that people also want sort of, you know, whatever opinionated, divisive you know, criticism that has something, you know, to you know, that you can hold on to instead of just sort of whatever, some like art form thing that you read for 15 minutes and then you just don't even remember what it said. So yeah, I don't think there's really any answer except that it's a really shit situation and like hopefully it improves. I mean, like my kind of long-term goal is to start a like I did like a self-produced kind of zine style publication last year, and I'll probably do another one. But like my long-term goal would be to like actually start a real magazine to hopefully counteract how bad the system is right now. But I think the easier way to put it is basically, unlike film critics or music critics or food critics or whatever, like those jobs exist to, you know, as information for consumers, for people to like find out about stuff, to, you know, find something and spend money on it. But art costing as much as it does, it's, you know, it's a rarefied market only for the very wealthy. And therefore, like, you know, I think in the last 20 years or so, the kind of powers that be in the art market basically clamped down and have sort of eroded the edifices that allowed criticism to exist, because someone saying that some art is bad just makes it harder to sell. And it's not really to anyone's economic benefit for critics to be dealing sort of with like an aesthetic discourse. So the art system has preferred to do without for a few decades, but I think nowadays, I think there's like, it's starting to be like a really big problem that, you know, emerging artists can't keep selling after, you know, their first hype cycle. So artists just don't have long careers anymore, and the work doesn't, you know, retain its value. And I think now the market is crumbling because, you know, you don't have a Jasper Johns anymore. You know, you don't have someone who's going to be revered for the rest of their life. Like any artist who's come up in the last 20 years, like there's like 10 that have not sort of tanked. There's a couple, and I don't even know if any of them are good. Maybe a few are, but you know, so I think that sort of now we're sort of running into the sort of downstream consequences of the death of arts discourse and criticism. So hopefully it has a comeback soon. Kat?
Really, it's a really quick question. Or hopefully, potentially. One difference between the two pieces, Wilde's and yours, was that Wilde's seemed to have a lot of openness in terms of, you know, the work of art as a starting place for essentially, you know, the creation of a new work of art, which is literary in nature, more or less. You can correct me if I'm wrong in my interpretation there. And that yours is much more obviously about qualitative judgment. And so I suppose I'd be interested in just understanding sort of like where you place qualitative judgment itself in relation to, you know, the work of the critic and the duty of the critic, you know, like is is qualitative judgment always necessary? To what degree? Can we find, can we write good criticism that is not always sort of laying an extremely clear qualitative judgment, as yours often does? That's something I sort of struggle with myself. Often I want to write about something and I want to, make a, weave a story or something that starts with a piece of art, but I don't always have like a snappy qualitative judgment to make.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that means I shouldn't write about it because I'm ambivalent or what.
No, I mean, I think I'm very peculiar in that sense, that I'm like I sort of trust my intuition with things in a very fundamental sense, where I just sort of, I can kind of do a snap judgment and like stick with it. And I very rarely regret having those, making the calls that I do. Even while like, I think it's important also to point out that I don't think I'm objective, and my own, I'll go back at like old reviews and be like, oh, that's not how I would look at it now. Like, I just like every year, I think I have like a different sort of preoccupation, and that's sort of like what I like looking at. And that comes through to me in my work. So I think that sort of reactive thing is just sort of the nature of critique. And I think it would be bad to act like it's objective, that these judgments are factually correct or something. And I think the Wilde piece did sort of bring that up at some point. Like, I think when he was saying that a critic is not sincere, he equated that with sort of believing in the consistency and correctness of judgments. But so I think, the reason I hammer on about judgment is that I think, like I've been saying, is that judgment is like a unpopular, like it's kind of a faux pas. And I think that criticism has suffered for its like phobia of the critical. And I think that what that's tied to is sort of this aversion to the subjectivity of the critic, which ignores the utility of the critic's own subjectivity in talking about art. And I think that's what Wilde says very well, is that you like a critic makes their own piece of writing in reaction to art, and that in making that piece of writing, it's their job to make their own art in the piece of criticism, because you bring, just as an artist brings whatever into their artwork, a critic hopefully brings something into the work itself. And I think this sort of kind of aversion to whatever, to the flippancy of subjective feeling has led to just a lot of really boring criticism that doesn't do anything. That doesn't mean that all criticism is necessarily judgment based. Like, I think, like I was saying, like Buchloh and like October Crowd, a lot of those people are more historians, or kind of the line blurs, but that they can write very sort of involved philosophical, political sort of analysis that can be very insightful and very rewarding. Like there's a couple of pieces in the readings by Thomas Crow, and I think he's a really good writer and like can be very insightful. And like I honestly prefer to read like art historians more than I do like criticism, because I think like I learn more about art and I, you know, sort of deepen my knowledge about art more in I tend to learn more from like art historical writing. And like I think Michael Fried is a great art historian, but I think his criticism is kind of insufferable on some level, or like over involved in a way that he doesn't step it back, but his sort of temperament, I think, works better in an art history context. But so yeah, I don't know. Did you have more that you were wanting to hear?
No, that helps a lot. I think yeah, I'm just sort of grappling with the with the issue of the qualitative judgment and that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, you know, the difference between me and Wilde, at least like when I read it, my feeling is like I almost agree with every single thing he says. And it's like if anything differs, it's like merely levels of emphasis, and that is, you know, mostly just because he wrote his piece 130 years before I did. So it's a different context. Ryan, did you have a question or?
Yeah, sorry. Apologies in advance for my microphone quality.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, what you think the interaction between the two things are, because we're kind of talking about, you know, this October crowd, you know, one of which was like one of my professors in undergrad, for example, that are kind of incentivized, right, to not have this subjective feeling that criticism kind of requires. And so I'm wondering, like, are those things necessarily separate?
I do think that there is a separation between criticism and art history. They're two different fields, and, you know, historical research versus sort of like, I guess a critic implies a sort of contemporary concern that history implies is not a contemporary concern. So there is like a division, but I think it can be a very small division at times. And, you know, certain writers can definitely blur the line in their own writing, you know, like dealing with a contemporary artist and then going backwards, or, you know, or someone like, you know, writing about contemporary artists, but not necessarily as a critic. And yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because I think because although I respect most of the October writers a lot and think, you know, the writing's very interesting, I've only really started getting interested in them in, you know, the last year or so, and haven't read all that much, but I've been very interested in sort of grappling with it, and I think there's just certain places of sort of where, you know, again, in a sort of like historical contextual mode where, you know, you can look at these old writings and think they're great and, you know, get something from them, but also I think there's an argument to be made that a lot of those writers, their kind of their perspective, their sort of preconditions that they worked from may have worked for them, but also sort of set the stage in a lot of ways for the failures of art writing now. So so it's an interesting sort of ambiguity in between those things. And like, I don't know, like I saw Buchloh do a talk a few months ago, and, you know, it was like for a release of a book of interviews with Hal Foster, and like because it was like occasioned by Buchloh like retiring from from Harvard, and also like saying that he's like retiring from criticism. And he kind of had sort of like a shockingly like negative or kind of pessimistic note that he kind of ended the talk on, where he was just like, well, you know, I'm retiring from criticism and criticism's over, and my position, you know, I don't need to do this anymore. And if, you know, people just want to do like art about their identity and don't want like judgment in their writing about art, then that's fine. And I give up, and it doesn't seem like anyone's doing criticism, so it's over. And like, I was in the audience, and I was like, you know, clearly could have raised my hand, but I didn't want to like make it all about me. So I've been meaning to write him an email and sort of like start a dialogue about this kind of contextual relationship, and sort of telling him that I see the need and that other people see the need, and that, you know, he doesn't need to be so pessimistic about the future of criticism, because I certainly don't think what he was fine with, I don't think is fine. So I think, but yeah, I think it's an open question to me at this point, sort of how to draw the lines between those things. But okay, so I guess we should talk about this assignment, which was, what did I say it was? Just like 2 pieces of critical writing on something you engage with during the week, up to 400 words each. And so that idea, my idea was basically just to, you know, loosely modeling this idea off of like what I do. Yeah, that's the assignment for the next class. And that but that, you know, I think I modeled it basically just off of what I do weekly usually. And but, you know, it's like I've said, that, you know, it's very hard to do sort of short form writing that's sort of has content, especially when you don't have a whole body of work. Like, you know, I don't think you know, especially when I started, and I think it's still true today, that like I don't think my reviews really stand on their own. I think it's much more sort of the cumulative effect of all of them in sequence. So those are just sort of my concerns, of just sort of like me being like, hey, like critique something. But I don't know. I you know, it's I don't know what I'm doing. I've never like taught a class before. So I was just wondering if anyone had any sort of you know, questions, concerns, thoughts, whatever. I mean, are you guys like, what's your reaction? Do any of you, do you guys think it's plausible to do something, or does it feel forced, or what? Yeah, Eric?
Yeah, I like the idea and the challenge. I'm curious, you know, I heard what you said about like taking real-time notes during, say, a gallery show, and I think that's a great idea. Trying that the other week. My question is, do you ever, when you're writing about something, do you go to a show multiple times? Sometimes just once? How does that work?
I pretty much never go to something twice, because I go to, you know, a dozen shows a week at least. Very rarely, I think, do I like something enough to go more than once. But I think that's like a great example of a sort of peculiarity of my process that you shouldn't be restricted to. And I think, you know, in that sense too, like, yeah, it can be about anything. I think is the baseline. Like, you can, if you want to get weird about it and write about, I don't know, the news or whatever, or, you know, your roommate, I don't know. Like you can do anything. And I think, you know, so with that in mind, like, I think if you want to do, you know, go to an art show or something and really dwell on it and maybe like do one piece instead of two 400-word pieces, do one 800-word piece or something. Like, I think my sort of rapid fire method is not like, you know, I don't really like recommend it readily to people. So I think there should be, you know, a wide purview of like however you want to interpret it, and just that whatever, you know, the you know, whatever, two pieces on 400 words each, like that was just, I just made that up. So like, I think it's much more important for you to sort of try to grapple with something in a way that feels engaging to you. So I think, you know, if you want to, you know, do spend hours in a gallery about one piece or something, whatever, like, I think that's perfectly fine. Like, I don't want there to be any sort of like necessity that whatever, my own writing be a model. So I think, you know, feel free to do whatever with it. Anything else? Well, does anyone? Yeah, you can use pictures. I'm really not interested in sort of dictating anything about it. I think that, I mean, I guess, you know, the class is called short form criticism, but that's, you know, that would be the only limit I would put on it. Yeah, Antonio?
Speaking of short form, like for your own stuff, do you establish a limit of characters or words, or is it really
No.
by intuition?
No, I kind of I do it kind of off the cuff, or, you know, I'll do something longer if I feel it. I really sort of I take as long as I feel I need to. And sometimes that's saying nothing, sometimes it's going at length. And so I think in that, I think you submit on the Google Classroom, but I literally don't know.
Are you reviewing them?
I think, yeah, that these are like these are the assignments that are part of my, I understand that I'm supposed to grade you, but I really don't know how this really works yet. I think maybe the final project is going to be bigger, but I don't even really know what the final project's going to be, or if I'm going to dictate that. So these may just be sort of practice runs on coming up with something that in 4 weeks you feel good about. But yeah, I think that the idea is that this assignment should be turned in by the start of our class next week.
I'll send out an email with instructions on where to put it. We'll create a folder in the drive.
Okay. But yeah, so does anyone have like a solid idea of what they're gonna want to do? I'm just curious.
I'm really lucky. I work in an art center.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that I don't like. So it's a little bit easier. Like, I don't have to like travel anywhere to,
Go. You're gonna be there anyways.
Yeah, I'll be at work. There'll be parts of and there are like 2 different exhibitions up. So I'll probably think of like 1 or 2 pieces from the different exhibitions that we have.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, Andrea.
You asked what you think they would want us to do with the assignments for the class. That were the question?
Yeah, like, yeah, just if you know what you're going to write about.
Oh, what I'm gonna write about. Oh, no,
Yeah.
I understood different things.
Oh, okay.
I'll just go check out some shows in LA and write it out. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Orally?
That's not for sure yet, but I think I might try to write about a nonfiction book that I'm reading and that I'm very much engaging with, and that's stirring up lots of thoughts in me and opinions, and that's very much I don't know, contemporary culture. Like, I don't know, I find that very stirring. But yeah, I'm not sure if, yeah,
Sure.
Let's see.
Ella? I think your mic's off.
Sorry. I just arrived in New York from Melbourne, and I've seen a couple of shows, so I'm kind of interested to just apply the outsider lens and just take things at face value. Could be interesting. Yeah.
Cool. Arnab?
I was thinking of working on the esoteric in like writing on the esoteric in 2 pieces of modern art, like either Kandinsky or perhaps someone else among the high modernists. So I haven't decided that as yet, but my content will be on the esoteric value in such works.
Yeah, I would just, having like a subject like that could be difficult in this length.
Yes.
But feel free to try for it.
Sure.
And Kat?
Thanks, Sean.
I'm going to be in Venice. I don't know if you've been, but if there's anything you would send me to that you've seen.
What's his name? The video art guy? Belgium?
Yeah. Yes.
People love him. I think specifically people who are 40 all love him. Just people who are like a small generation older than me he seems to be like their god, and I can't.
Is it Pierre Huyghe?
Yeah.
Huyghe?
Huyghe?
I'm not sure how to say that.
I think that's how you say it. Huyghe.
Huyghe.
Yeah.
He's on my list.
Yeah. Antonio?
Yeah, I don't know what I will do yet, but just a suggestion for Kat, because she's in Venice. There is a nice thing at Prada Foundation. So it's not the Biennale, but it's also nice to go.
Oh, what is it at Prada?
Prada, like Prada?
Yeah. Actually, I don't know, but my girlfriend was just there and she said really good things about it. But it's like the interesting thing about it is that you almost didn't understand that it was an art show. Like it looks like it would be, I don't know how to say it in English, like the place that like buys gold and sells gold, like this very cheap thing. You enter and then somehow it's this tracing the history of capitalism or its manifestations in the contemporary world.
Is it this one with all the books?
Yeah, I think
okay,
so.
yeah, it's Monte di Pieta.
Yeah,
that looks interesting.
Yeah. So suggestion for you, Kat.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. All right, well, Anything else, anyone? Or maybe we should just call it. I don't know, unless anyone has something to. Yeah, Eric.
Just like some final thoughts. I thought that like notion of the importance of a distinct personality in the wild work was really interesting, and like maybe contrary to some of the received wisdom I've gathered of kind of like flattening your personality to a stance of impartiality or something, but instead like sharpening that personality. Just that like got me thinking a lot. Also, this idea that if you do have, like, as you're framing it, this body of development at your disposal that maybe takes a decade or something, maybe longer, maybe plus or minus, then you're maybe in a position to really arrive at substantial snap judgments, and you only need to taste the wine, or you only need to read the first 10 pages of the book to decide if you want to go on. And I'm like excited to apply that to going to see, say, painting, for example, in the future, instead of, I don't know, just like trying that methodology out, where if I go into a show with 10 paintings, maybe I can, I mean, I guess I already do this, but maybe you can determine very quickly, looking at the first painting, whether or not, you think it's any good. And you don't need, right. Like, obviously there's a benefit to then seeing the rest of the 9 paintings, perhaps going to the show a second time. If it like passes that first test of like, okay, the snap judgment tells me it's good, it's worth like digging my teeth into. I thought that was.
Yeah, I think that it's sort of it is an interesting sort of kind of anti-received wisdom thing of just sort of like, like, I do believe that you can judge a book by its cover. Like, a book's cover can be very informative about like what the book is like. And, just like this notion of like art is subjective, and like, you never know what it's going to be. So like, don't be too hasty, but it's like saying that is, I think, at odds with sort of the breadth of your own lived experience. And that like, I don't know, I know, like, I've heard like academics talk about how like, responding to like students asking like, how do you read all these books? How do you like understand, the entire scope of the history of philosophy or something? Because like, there's too many books, there's too much to read. Like, it takes 5 years to read all of Kant. So how can you, whatever, like, but that, there's this notion that like, once you actually get your, bearings, you can sort of flip through a book or kind of figure out the gist of another, philosopher through reading one philosopher. Like, just that, like, I've, just stuff like where, I remember like first reading like some Deleuze when I was like 25, and just being sort of like floored at being like, how does this guy, like, how did he, I guess it was Deleuze and Guattari, and being like, well, how do they know all this stuff? Like, this is crazy. And then like, after time, you realize like, oh, well, this is just like people who've studied like a lot of philosophy, and just like stuff where it's like, I've never read any Marx, I've never read any Freud. It doesn't mean I can't like talk about their ideas. And so like, just this sort of wider notion of just like that, you can make a call, you can say, maybe I don't need to do this. Maybe this isn't for me. And, like that's something that I'm like, actually, that was very like interesting for me leading up to when I started doing criticism, was like, I had spent my 20s really just obsessively exposing myself to like as much like music and film and stuff that I could find. And it was just sort of like this blooming flower of like, oh, there's new stuff. Oh, there's new stuff. And like, just sort of, I developed like a kind of bad relationship to media because I sort of was so hastily going through things that I'm not good at like having a long-term relationship with like an album or something. Like I'll wear some music out in like a week. And then like by the time I was like in my late 20s, I was like, I'm like, oh, I'm kind of bottoming out. Like I don't have new things to expose myself to. Like, so then you're kind of left to sort of cycle through and deepen the things you already know. And like, which is just, I only bring that up just in the sense of like, you know, whatever, when I was 21 and you present me with like 10 artists or philosophers or something, I felt a like obligation to, you know, do my due diligence on all of them. Whereas now I'd feel comfortable maybe, you know, rejecting all of them out of hand. And that's just, I you know, it's like, in that sense, it's just like that sort of the practicalities of, you know, experience, that navigating the world sort of develops over time. Swati?
Hi, can you hear me? Hi,
Yep.
so I'm thinking of writing, I'm participating in the Upstate Art Weekend this time, and it's my first time. I don't know what kind of artists and what kind of galleries participate in it, but I'm just kind of curious, and maybe if there's something you would recommend I check out.
What is it?
The Upstate Art Weekend.
Oh yeah, I've never been to I mean,
Yeah,
I don't have a
even
car, so I can't, it's hard to get upstate.
me neither. Yeah, it's my first time, so let's see.
Well, all I know is there's that new space like the campus where like 5 galleries like bought like an old school or
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
And I think that I saw some pictures. My friends went this weekend, and like I know that there's like a Yuta Koto room that looks good, but I think that would be probably the most interesting thing upstate right now. That would be my guess.
Okay, I'll check it out.
Yeah.
And another topic that yeah, sorry, you were saying.
No, go ahead.
Another topic that I wanted to kind of just unravel for myself is like I've been exploring. So I'm new to the art world, of course. My background is in architecture, and I've rented out this space in the Lower East Side, and these art spaces that are so ephemeral and in a very kind of what do you call it, gentrified Chinatown. So I mean, it's really interesting how artists are thriving, and I want to maybe write about this kind of ephemerality and in between spaces that art starts to occupy in the city. And I don't have a criticism per se, but just kind of observations and very interesting ways of how even commerce starts kind of occupying the streets and kind of yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, all I would say is that's a big topic, and you know, the sort of cycles of gentrifying in New York and sort of I mean, you know, I've lived in New York for what, 5.5 years, and in that time the Lower East Side has changed entirely like 3 times. It's like it's been unrecognizable through multiple cycles in that period. So it's you know, it's a lot. So it's like, I think in terms of like the focuses of the course, it's likely that's like, you know, that's like an essay form to that something that requires. I think like the interest, I think, of sort of the exercise is this sort of like dealing with a sort of reactive experience to something specific, rather than like an essay on a subject, but like sort of, you know, like reacting to a thing.
I'd be happy to explore, one of these hole in the wall galleries or spaces in the Lower East Side or something like that. I'll try to be more specific, of course. But
Yeah, I think if you wanted to, yeah, I mean, especially you said you have an architecture background, if you want to like, deal with something with that, I think that works.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Sorry to interrupt. I think we're just about out of time. We do have the Discord chat, so we can continue conversing there. And since we didn't get to the introductions this week, we'll certainly do them next week.
Cool.
But please, if you have any final remarks or thoughts.
All good.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.